This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 338th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. It's been an exciting month for me. Much to my surprise, my diesel punk historical novel, Storming, has been doing pretty well on the awards circuit. It won the Lyra Grand Prize for Book of the Year and has been listed as a finalist or semi-finalist in 3 other ongoing competitions, which is undyingly cool all to itself. But then I discovered this week that it also won a Silver Ippy Award. I honestly wasn't even sure it would be allowed in the fantasy genre it was entered in, since it's as much historical as it is speculative. So it's been very exciting to see it doing so well. Yay! The latest post on my blog is one major pitfall of writing strong characters. Writing strong characters will bring your book to life, but it can also lead to the mistake of leaving out one of your character's most interesting traits. Visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com to find out what it is. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled, Do You Have a Writing Superpower? And Why You Shouldn't. There's a refrain I often hear in popular writing advice, and I hate it. Basically, it runs like this. All writers are naturally better at one part of writing over another. It's kinda like having a very unbalanced writing superpower. Now, on the surface, this idea is as true as it gets. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses. We all have aspects of the craft we're good at and others we're still working on. But the gist of this refrain is that there are certain things about writing that all writers are naturally going to stink at. Tell me if you've heard any of these before. All writers are going to be better at either plotting or pantsing. All writers are going to be better at either characters or plot. All writers are going to be better at either ideas or execution. All writers are going to be better at either dialogue or narrative. I'm sure you can probably come up with some more examples of your own. If you haven't already figured out where I'm going with this, I'll tell you. This is horseradish. The first problem, and most obvious problem, with these statements is their absolute nature. Consider characters versus plot. True, one or the other may come more easily to many writers. But I've always tripped over the idea that I supposedly had to be more naturally inclined to one or the other. I've always found them equally easy, or equally hard, depending on the day. Universal statements are inevitable, but they're only useful insofar as they're true. If you find yourself squirming when you're told you're naturally good at only half of writing, and therefore naturally bad at the other half, stop squirming. Because very likely, it is not true at all. So, are you naturally better at one thing over another? Short answer, probably. As Hemingway said, we are all apprentices at a craft no one masters. Now, note that by naturally, we're talking about being suited by nature for certain things over others. In other words, we're talking about aspects of the writing craft that your brain is specifically wired to be good at. So this comes down to personality as much as anything. Plotting versus pantsing is a good example of this. Outlining is something that comes comparatively naturally and easily to me. Pantsing, not so much. And I know many of you can attest to the opposite. It's important to understand yourself both as a person and a writer. The better you understand how your brain and your personality work and why they work, the more effectively you can hack your life and your process to reach maximum effectiveness with minimum effort. But the thing I dislike so much about these all writers are naturally better at this or that statements is that they carry this inherent whisper that it's okay to be less than good at one part of the process or the other. Now, we all know that a protagonist's greatest weakness is almost always inherent in his greatest strength. Superman? Yeah, he's invincible because he's from the planet Krypton. But guess what? The very origin of his strength is also his downfall. Kryptonite. That can easily become a problem with this either-or issue for writers. At this moment, maybe your writing superpower is coming up with great ideas rather than executing them well in story form on the page. If so, congrats on your awesome imagination. However, taken as a whole, this is not a good scenario. The word versus is your kryptonite. Throw it out the window right now because it is killing you. It's not enough to be good at any one thing in writing. Even if you're downright brilliant at that one thing, you'll never reach full potential if you rest on that laurel. As a writer, you gotta be good at everything. So let's consider the 4 examples I offered at the beginning of the episode. Perhaps one of them made you wince. No worries. All you gotta do is kick the either out of those statements and replace it with a more empowering reality. For example, number 1, how to be good at both plotting and pantsing. Now, this one is a little different from the others since it's about your personal process rather than an actual aspect of the craft. So first, let's get rid of the idea that you have to do one or the other if you're going to be a good writer. Many great writers outline their stories. Many great writers pants their stories. Simple as that. The ultimate choice is up to you and which process best hacks your personality. However, almost all authors, even adamant outliners such as myself, ultimately use a mix of the 2 approaches. We plot some parts and we pants others. Both are necessary skills. Think of plotting as a logical left brain activity and pantsing as a creative right brain activity. If you're going to write a great book, you're going to need both sides of your brain. Here's one of the most important things you can possibly learn about being a writer. Do not stuff yourself into someone else's pigeonhole. Find the balance that works for you and use it to write your best stories. Number 2, how to be good at both plot and character. The plot versus character idea is arguably the most destructive in my book. Why? Because you absolutely cannot write a good story without both of these elements being in top form. Plot and character must work together so seamlessly that even you as the writer can hardly decipher where one ends and the other begins. Plot is character, and character is plot. And that sounds like a riddle, but it's not. Once you understand story structure, aka plot, and how it's really all about structuring the character arc, you realize they're like twining DNA strands. And what this means is that if you're struggling with one, you're really struggling with both. That's the bad news. The good news is that if you improve one, you necessarily improve the other. Number 3, how to be good at both ideas and execution. So raise your right hand if you've picked up a book that had an awesome premise, only to be disappointed because the author totally failed to take advantage of it. Raise your left hand if you've picked up a book that was well written from beginning to end, but utterly forgettable because the idea was so blasé and overdone. Of the 2, execution is by far the easier to learn. After all, that's what all of us are learning every single day we study the craft, how to better execute our ideas on the page. But it's worth the reminder that a great idea on its own does not make a great story. The hero's journey is pretty much the same story told over and over again. When a particular book or movie takes that formula and rises above the pack, it's because of its execution of that storyline. Now, what if you're great at execution but struggle with ideas? Can you learn to come up with great ideas? I believe you can. It's all about digging deep into the heart of yourself and your passions and sweeping aside the inclination to follow other writers' well-worn paths and learning how to combine interesting elements until you reach the juxtaposition of something unique and interesting. And finally, number 4, how to be good at both dialogue and narrative. No way around it. Both narrative and dialogue are essential to artful stories. Put them together and they're the whole of the story. When I'm deciding whether or not to buy a book to read, I always consider both of these. Is the dialogue punchy and subtext laden? Or is it flat and on the nose? Is the narrative lively with an engaging voice? Or does it sound like Mr. Monotone, Ben Stein from the eye drop commercials, telling me everything straight up as though I was a 3-year-old. Both narrative and dialogue present their own challenges, but they're also similar in a lot of ways. They both boil down to the same basic principles: rich, engaging voice, some textual nuance, and showing rather than telling. Dialogue, of course, has the added burden of mimicking real life and creating interaction between characters. Narrative bears its own responsibility of showing the characters' interior lives, sharing important information without boring readers, and managing the overall ebb and flow of pacing in the story. If either is lacking, readers will notice and the story will suffer. Now, for more information on all of these topics, I've included links for further reading if you go to the transcript of this episode on my blog at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. So, recognize your writing superpower and super weakness for exactly what they are: indications of the areas in your writing that need more balance. If you're already great at dialogue, that's fantastic. Now, make sure your narrative is also up to speed. If you're a wild pantser, see if a little structure might not help you build a better story. And by the same token, if you're a rigid plotter, see where a little unplanned creativity might lead you today. Don't rest on the laurels of your strengths. And just as importantly, never be discouraged by the idea that you'll never be able to improve your weaknesses because you're naturally bad at them. Maybe it's true you're wired to be weaker in some areas than others, but probably not. And even if you are, most strengths end up all the stronger when they don't come easily in the beginning. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.